Redditors who have hired a private investigator, what did you find out? I had a girlfriend that worked for one for a while. She said that the majority of their work was insurance scams. She took a lot of pictures of guys who said they were hurt on the job playing golf and surfing and such. One of my jobs is to search for long lost relatives, usually several generations ago. Typically, the case is about old plots of land where I should track down owners or their heirs to update the land registry because a state wants to build there something. Let me tell you, the amount of information you can find on Google and in public records is astounding if you know where to look. Not me, but a friend hired one because he was suspicious his stepdad was being unfaithful to his mom. So, he asked me, and I put him in contact with a guy I knew. Bit of a backstory, the stepdad is 5 minutes and 10 seconds, 160-ish pounds. My friend is 6 feet 2 inches 235 pounds, ripped. At 15, when my friend's mom and stepdad started dating, my friend gave her the typical "you hurt her, you're dead" speech. Also his BO dad walked out on him and his sister when my friend was like 4. It took a while, but my friend warmed up to the guy and he's a good guy. Took my friend and I to an 49's game once, which was pretty cool. Anyways, the pie said he wasn't cheating. Apparently there was a house on the market that my friend's mom wanted and he bought it. He had been remodeling it for some time and he kept it a secret. As a 5-year anniversary gift to her, he bought it. Anyways, they live in a 5-bed house now. I know someone that hired a pet detective to find their cat and he fucking found him. My little brother hired one to find his dog. He was living in LA and his complex let the dog out on accident. Small dog, some mutt of toy breeds. He looked on his own for 2 weeks and was devastated. My folks found this guy in Indiana who was like $3K to hire, but he guaranteed he'd find the dog or he wouldn't get paid. My folks and I chipped in as my brother couldn't afford that. The guy found my brother's dog inside of a day. Shit was wild. I was a private investigator for a little bit. Most work pies do is searching financial/court records and serving documents. But one time I was paid by wealthy parents to stake out their college senior who had stopped returning their calls. They were worried about her. These parents paid like $40K for round-the-clock monitoring just to find out their daughter dropped out of school and was a full-time ski bum. BTW stakeouts are mostly just sitting in your car eating all day. My dad hired a pie in the mid-90s in Eastern Europe to find out if one of his business partners was stealing from him. Instead he found out his own brother was stealing from him. He refused to believe the pie and his brother robbed him blind. Took a huge amount of money and left him with gigantic debt. He still forgave him. Had a babysitter we thought was stealing from us. Luckily our neighbor was a pie couple and they ran a background check for $10. Babysitter had a string of DUIs and a few days before a large fine was due, my camera disappeared. He also stole money from my kids' piggy banks. He sort of disappeared, but was also really into Instagram, so I surreptitiously followed him. He started babysitting again for a single mom. Easy target, and posted a lot of fun pics with this family. I tracked down the mom and sent her a long email detailing out his whole scam. She said we were right and it was clear he'd been stealing from her business. He has since gone underground, but I still Google him regularly to see what he's up to. He's been able to avoid arrests for a while now. Back in the 90s my dad had a friend who owned an old Clio Williams, and one day someone stole his car. The car was located in Athens. So after reporting the event to the police he really wanted to get his car back because it was expensive, and he hired a private investigator to find his car. After like a week he received a call from the investigator telling him that his car was located at a junkyard outside of Thessaloniki. So he went at Thessaloniki and found his car, so he rushed inside a police station to inform them that his car is located at X location. Believe it or not, the officer told him not to mess with the owner of the junkyard. This junkyard was known for stealing cars etc. and hoped he will get his money back from insurance. My law firm had a bad faith insurance case several years ago. A guy had gotten hurt at work. He claimed he was disabled because he hurt his back and could not lift anything or really engage in any type of physical activity. His disability insurance carrier failed to handle the claim and pay him what was owed. There was a potential for relatively large damages. In fact, the carrier filed in the court case what is known as an offer to confess judgment. It's a way of agreeing to let judgment be taken for that amount. The plaintiff can accept the offer or reject it. However, if he rejects the offer, he is responsible for the defendant's attorney's fees. If the verdict ends up being less than the amount of the offer to confess judgment, the offer in this case was $750,000, he rejected the offer. A few weeks later, our PI found out that the plaintiff bowled every week. The PI got video of the plaintiff bowling and copies of his score sheets going several years back through the date of the accident. It was clear he really was not disabled. He also found that plaintiff had been in a car wreck and was making identical injury claims to the other driver's insurance carrier. We filed a motion with the court to dismiss the lawsuit based upon fraud and perjury. The court set the motion for a hearing, but before that happened, the plaintiff dismissed his lawsuit. My sister, mid-30s, is adopted and hired one to find her estranged biological father. They came back saying that not only was he still alive and nearby, but he had a daughter, meaning she also had a biological sibling. Further digging from the PI uncovered that they weren't just similar ages either, they were exactly the same age. The evidence suggested that my sister had a twin and her birth father had taken the twin and vanished. Huge, life-changing news. Eventually, through more incredible detective work, the PI realized that the daughter was actually just my sister. There was no other sibling, and they had just been investigating my sister the whole time accidentally. Needless to say, we asked for the money back. TL. Doctor, sister hired a private investigator. Private investigator accidentally investigated sister. My grandmother's first boyfriend after my grandfather died said he was a retired cop and a veteran. They enjoyed dancing to country music together and bought a new car in her name though, even though she can't drive anymore. My uncles hired a PI. Turns out that old bastard had a habit of shacking up with widows and bleeding them dry. The boyfriend, not the PI. Hadn't heard from my mom since I was about 15. Very unstable due to drugs and alcohol etc. When I was 29, I decided it was time to find out what happened to her. I figured if she was a Jane Doe somewhere, then I could put her to rest, and if she was alive, then I wanted to let her know that I forgave her. Hired a PI to help. I guess she was moved by my story, and so she also ran info for the man my mother was apparently married to on the house. And with one clue from his report, I was able to track them down. I wouldn't have found my mom alive and was just starting out on recovery after being homeless and addicted for many years if it wasn't for the PI who kindly ran an extra report for free. Mom has remained sober now for about 7 years and is probably the healthiest she's ever been, physically and emotionally. I know somebody who was like an assistant to the actual PI. She basically went to bingo with a camera in her purse to capture video of a woman. The woman claimed that a car accident had completely immobilized her, but she would take off the neck brace all the time, playing bingo hours on end. Nothing exciting, just capturing fraud. My mother's dad walked out on mom, my aunt, and my grandmother when mom was just 5. A few years later, my grandmother died of a grand mal seizure. Mom was taken in by her grandparents, but she always wondered why her dad left and what became of him. In her 40s, she saved up a bit and hired a PI to track him down. Turns out he moved over time from Pittsburgh to California, where he wound up in prison for armed robbery and so other violent crimes. He died in San Quentin Penitentiary. I think mom got a lot of closure out of that. She was able to see that life would have most likely been even worse had he stayed, at least living with her grandparents. She was loved and raised to fulfill her potential. On the other end of the PI spectrum, I was in a bad car accident 13 years ago. I was rear-ended at a red light by a lady going 45. Most of my injuries were soft tissue damage minus the TMJ. Fast forward 8 years. Finally had my court date to see if I'd get $90K in damages. They show camera footage from 4 years prior covering 3 whopping days of me pushing a grocery cart, carrying groceries and talking on the phone. Apparently that's enough to determine that you're fine. Present day, every morning my hands go numb. It takes 3 days to clean one room. I can't braid my hair. Various other numerous tasks that take me way longer than any other normal 41-year-old. Sometimes you have to do things because you still want to feel normal, not like you're a 90-year-old woman. I was the recipient of a pie. I came home from work one day and my BF asked to have my engagement ring as he wanted to take it to be professionally cleaned. The second he handed it over, he accused me of cheating on him. The conversation went back and forth for ages. I was beside myself. I couldn't believe what he was saying, and he would not believe I was innocent. He then told me he'd had me followed for 6 weeks by a pie who had seen me get into a red Mini. It was a girl I knew giving me a lift to work, but he would not believe me. I knew then it was over and packed my things and left. I told him to get in touch with the pie and have another look at this so-called evidence that I was cheating. An hour later he turns up at where I was staying begging to have me back. He'd realized his mistake. There was no way I was going to get back with someone who would behave that way though, so we parted ways. I used to work for an insurance defense firm years ago. Best pie story I have is where we hired one to tail a guy who was suing our client for an injury that wasn't entirely our client's fault. The guy was refusing to settle and was insisting on going to trial, even though we offered a fair sum that would have paid his medical bills. The pie we hired got some good pics that showed the plaintiff was nowhere near as injured as he claimed, but the crown jewel of the photos was one where the guy was walking on a pier with a woman who wasn't his wife, had his hand on her ass and everything. Later in a deposition, the attorney slid the picture to the plaintiff and said something like, "Mr. Smith, obviously not his real name. Who is the woman in this picture? We would like to schedule a deposition with her as well." The guy went ghost white and told his attorney he wanted to settle. At least he was smart enough to realize that if his wife found out the other woman was gonna be deposed, he was gonna have to get a family law attorney as well, because the divorce papers would soon follow. I didn't hire one, but my batshit crazy abusive ex did. A few months after we started dating, I felt like I was being watched and saw the same car following me. He said I was crazy, but then a year later he was all, "You know how you thought you were being followed when we first dated? You were. I hired a pie. Haha." He seriously thought it was so funny. I was shocked and pissed off because I wasn't doing anything untrustworthy. I asked if he found out anything, and he replied, "Oh yeah, they said you went shoe shopping when you told me you were grocery shopping. You were totally lying." I spent the next 2 years trying to leave the emotionally and physically abusive relationship. He threatened to burn my family's house down or kill me if I did. Finally managed to plan and execute a safe escape, but he stalked and harassed me afterwards, and I had to get a restraining order. I had the same being watched feeling, and the cops had to warn him, but he claimed hiring a pie wasn't a breach of row, and he had a right to know what I was doing. He also told me he hired a pie to check up on a teacher who once laughed at him and couldn't wait until she died to piss on her grave. My oldest niece's dad married a woman who was controlling. She ended up convincing him to take my sister to court for full custody of my niece, which ended up stressing my sister out so much that her water broke at 29 weeks. My parents hired a pie and found out that his wife was using it to buy groceries instead of the money he was giving her, and that she was getting prescriptions from 12 different doctors and a bunch of other fucked up shit. He ended up contacting her parents, who he was told were dead. After he introduced himself, her dad immediately asked how much she took from him. He wasn't the first guy she had done it to. She also wasn't using her real name. He ended up divorcing her, and she's currently doing time in prison for a handful of charges. My wife and I are friends with a lot of bar owners and bartenders because of her job. We knew this one owner/tender. We will call him Dinner. That was the nicest fucking guy. Like, if he knew you were sick, he would cover your shift at your bar and then give you the tips he made that night. Just the best guy. Then one night we are drinking with another bartender friend, Ben. Ben lets us know that Dana has brain cancer. He's been keeping it quiet, but Ben has been giving him money, upwards of $5,000, for treatment. My wife and I were about to give money to Ben to pass on. Then Dana's business partner got suspicious and hired a pie to follow Dana on a day he took off for medical reasons. Turned out Dana spent the day drinking at another bar. No doctor visits. The business partner confronts Dana, who comes clean. He did not have cancer. He was just saying that to get money from his friends. Apparently lots of bartenders had been giving him money. Dana is more or less run out of town. He moved to a different city, and I know he slowly paid Ben back, but it took a couple years. I'm not sure what happens to him since. A pie tried to contact me about my father a few years ago. She was extremely rude and pushy and intimidated my sweet mother by showing her a pistol she wore on her waistband. She called me once, yelling at me about why I was hiding from her, calling me my father's name. Took her 5 minutes to stop talking long enough for me to explain who I was. Warned her that if she ever threatened my mother again, I was just as armed and I'd call an actual police officer to calm her ass down. She never bothered us again. My boyfriend's family hired a pie to do some cover genealogy because they're white but all have thick wiry hair that only black hairdressers can handle. And because there are things older folks in these parts just don't talk about. Turns out there's a fair amount of Lumbee Indian, a community founded by disenfranchised Native Americans and escaped slaves back in the day, in boyfriend's family, which explains the hair. My mom's best friend. She divorced her husband and was awarded full custody of their daughter. His family was a shit show. He kidnapped his daughter and he and his parents just disappeared. This was easier in 1977 than it is now. She tried hiring a pie but couldn't afford one. So she started learning how to trace people on her own. In the days before the internet, she spent years doing this whenever she wasn't waitressing. She did find her daughter in '81, but by this time her daughter was poisoned against her. Mom's friend went on to get her pie license and was a pie specializing in women's issues for the next 2 decades. I don't know what happened to her after that. If she's alive, she would be in her 80s, I think. I have a story about private investigators doing a hilariously shit job. So, years ago, my brother injured his back at work because of his employer's unsafe work practices. During the ensuing suit, my brother's lawyer was given a folder full of documents from the employer's team. Turns out, they had hired a pie to investigate my brother to prove that his injury was faked. Well, unfortunately, the pie had been taking pictures of me operating an ATV mounted leaf hopper. My brother walked into the court hearing and watched the color drain from the opposing lawyers' faces when he introduced himself, looking nothing like me. In his 20s, Miso hired a pie to find out what had become of the childhood bully who had made his life hell and who had vowed to kill him. Actually, he did try by bringing a loaded gun to school, but some other kid ratted him out, and the bully got expelled but still lived in the neighborhood for a few more years and beat up Mai, so every chance he got. The pie found the bully living in a town more than an hour outside the big city in a dead-end job. He'd been arrested for assault and public drunkenness a couple times. That info helped Miso get past his fear that the guy would find him someday and make good on his threat. My work requires us to hire pies to investigate injury claims. We had this high schooler claiming a head injury so severe that he basically couldn't live a normal life. Specifically, he had an issue with bright lights, couldn't stare at a computer or TV long, etc. Our pie caught him on several occasions at the movies, arcade, basketball games, etc. So basically he was making a fraudulent claim. My uncle was a private investigator. In high school my friends and I were getting flashed by a guy constantly. He would do things like iron while naked at his window every time the bus dropped us off. I hated it, so told my uncle, who was very concerned this guy's behavior would escalate. So he started filming him doing it, then went on a local news program to discuss it, and the guy moved out the next day. Not mine specifically, but my mother hired one to spy on the school. See, my little brother is dyslexic and has severe social anxiety, and so was struggling a lot in a public school setting. He had an IEP, which the teachers and principal were insisting was being followed. But every day my brother would come home in tears, shaking because he felt abandoned and stupid. So mom hired the investigator, and sure enough the teachers were basically just ignoring my brother. They'd sit him in the back of the room and demand he do his work, then wouldn't help him through it. Then they'd yell at him because he didn't do it. Again, he couldn't write because of the dyslexia. With all the evidence, my mom was able to arrange a meeting with the school board and threatened to sue. They agreed to pay his tuition for a private school that was supposed to help. It didn't, and mom ended up just pulling him out and homeschooling him. He's been doing a lot better. My dad was cheating on my mom with 2 different old men. Both of them don't know about the other one. He says he isn't gay or anything. He's doing it for the money. He told us that he's in their wills and everything, and that they are just friends. I don't believe it. How do you end up in a friend's will? There's definitely something else going on, but he won't admit it. My mom calls him El Buta as a code word for him. It means a vulture in Spanish. My grandfather once hired a PI to investigate my grandmother. While spying on her from his car, another investigator he knew came up frantically to his window and was like, "What are you doing here?" To which his response was obviously, "What are you doing here?" Turns out my grandmother was being investigated by the D for drug dealing. I don't think anything came of it that I know of, but we are all pretty certain it's the reason the old family barn was burned down. That woman is batshit crazy, and this isn't even the worst/wackiest story I've been told about her. My uncle disappeared without a trace in the 1990s, about a year after his daughter was kidnapped and murdered. We hired a PI to track him down, and the PI found next to nothing. As my uncle had developed a heroin problem following my cousin's murder, the best guess the PI had is that he had died by odd or suicide, and that his body hadn't been found, or he was reported as a John Doe. Imagine my family's surprise 2 decades later when my uncle calls my mother, who is his only sibling. My grandfather had been on his deathbed for a month, and somehow the uncle found out. He arrived to make a show of paying his respects in an attempt to get money out of his parents. When it was clear he wasn't getting anything, he took off once again. He never gave us a real or detailed explanation of why he left, where he'd been, and what he'd been doing. He left no address or telephone number and made no attempts to remain in contact. The PI we hired must have been a shitty one. That or my uncle really knows how to disappear. I did not. A friend did to check if the husband was cheating on her as he flirted with one girl they both worked with. This was the source of many arguments. Well, the PI had a huge zoom lens and got some very explicit images of the husband having outdoor sex with the girl. Somehow the wife forgave him. They are still together. Not a PI, but my girlfriend's mother wanted to find an old British boyfriend she got when she was young. This was before Facebook and all that, and he was an old guy and didn't have any online presence at all, but I was able to track him down through one of his daughters. When we tried to contact him, he was elusive and suspicious. He didn't believe me at first. When they finally met, he explained that he received a lot of harassment for his beliefs. Turn out he was an Holocaust denier and wrote a book about that. The conclusion of my girlfriend's mother was that sometimes it's better to leave things in the past. I had to hire one to help gather evidence to defend myself against an assault charge. The story goes like this. X attacks me in front of a witness that I don't know, steals my phone, then calls the cops on me. I get arrested, and she wipes my phone and steals some incriminating evidence from my place while I'm in jail. I get out and hire the PI to try and track down the witness. The Friday before a Tuesday trial, I finally find the guy and have the PI go to talk to him to avoid witness tampering. Guy refuses to get involved, so I think I'm fucked. BC, my ex is this tiny little girl who plays the victim all too well. I call up my lawyer to accept the plea deal. Turns out the prosecutor had barely spoken to the ex until that day. Due to fortunate timing, the prosecutor met with my ex before my lawyer could get a hold of them. The prosecutor realizes my ex is completely deranged and also admits to having attacked me multiple times that night, destroying any case. I get the call, all charges dropped. Most relief I've ever felt in my life. So, the weird thing was, the PI didn't really help directly, but working with him to find this witness kept me from accepting the shitty plea deal for just long enough for things to work themselves out. My grandma's older brother was kidnapped whenever he was under 10 years old. I can't remember exactly how old, from the state fair. It was believed his uncle was the one that took him because his dad passed away early on and his brother wasn't happy that my great grandma got custody and another man was raising his nephew. One day we were sitting out on the back porch looking through old photo albums when we came across a picture of him, and my grandma told us about what happened. About 1.5 years to 2 years later her health went downhill. It was 60+ years since he was kidnapped, and my grandma was a couple months from passing. So my mom and aunt hired a PI who managed to find him. He had been living in Brazil ever since he was taken and had an entire family down there. They got to reconnect over FaceTime, and she got to meet an entire side of her family she didn't even know existed. They talked on the phone and FaceTimed numerous times a week all the way up until she passed.